All right, so today we're tackling a question that people have been arguing about forever. What is justice? And to help us try to figure that out, we're diving into a book by Thomas Sowell called The Quest for Cosmic Justice.
It's a book that really gets you thinking differently about fairness.
Definitely makes you rethink some assumptions. So
Yeah.
ready.
So one of the things that Sowell does in this book that I find really fascinating is that he doesn't just talk about justice as like one thing.
Yeah.
He actually breaks it down into two different types.
Okay.
Traditional justice and cosmic justice.
Okay, so let's break down those two types, because traditional justice, I feel like, is the one that we're all pretty familiar with. You know, it's the classic image of Lady Justice with her scales,
Right.
blindfolded.
Right.
And it really is about the process, like, were the rules followed?
Yes.
Was the punishment fitting for the crime?
Exactly. It's really focused on individual actions and making sure that everybody gets a fair shake
Yeah.
within the existing system. But cosmic justice, that's a whole different ballgame.
Right, because it's less about the steps taken and more about the end result.
Yeah.
It's asking, are things fair overall?
Exactly.
Are certain groups, consistently ending up better or worse off than others? And if so, why?
Yeah, and it wants to know why.
Yeah.
It's not just about the immediate situation. It's about looking beyond that and asking those bigger questions about the systems.
And that's where I feel like Sal starts to raise some eyebrows, because he's arguing that this quest for cosmic justice, as well-intentioned as it is,
Yeah.
can actually lead to some unintended negative consequences.
He's not saying we shouldn't strive for fairness, but he's saying, hey, let's be aware of the potential pitfalls here.
Okay, so let's get into those potential pitfalls then.
Okay.
What are some of Sowell's biggest concerns about this focus on cosmic justice?
So one of the biggest things he talks about is that trying to achieve perfect equality of outcome for everyone can actually be a recipe for disaster. He says it's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You just can't do it.
Not gonna work.
People have different talents. They make different choices. They have different circumstances.
Yeah.
And honestly, luck plays a role.
Oh, yeah, huge.
Trying to engineer perfectly equal outcomes for everyone just ignores these basic realities of life.
Well, and even if you could somehow magically achieve perfect equality at one point in time, it would immediately start to shift again, right?
Immediately.
As people make different decisions and as life happens.
Exactly. And in order to try to maintain that equality that you've created, you would need so much control.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Over people's lives.
Yeah, you'd have to micromanage every little thing.
Yeah.
Which actually brings us to, I think, another one of Sal's concerns, which is the impact on individual responsibility.
Yeah.
He argues that if we're always focused on outcomes, then we might start to ignore the role of individual choices and actions. It's almost like saying, well, if you're not successful, it must be someone else's fault.
Right. It creates this culture of victimhood.
Yeah.
Where people are discouraged from taking ownership of their lives and striving for improvement.
It's like blaming the game instead of learning how to play the game better.
That's such a good analogy.
And what I think is so powerful about Sowell's writing is he doesn't just talk about these ideas in the abstract.
Yeah.
He gives so many real-world examples.
Tons.
To illustrate his point.
So many.
Like, for example, when he talks about income inequality. He doesn't deny that discrimination exists.
No.
But he challenges the assumption that that's the only explanation for why some groups might earn more than others.
Yeah.
As he says, let's consider other factors like the choices that people make.
Right. And he points out that people choose different career paths.
Right.
They invest different amounts of time and energy into education and training. And honestly, they have different levels of work ethic.
Yeah.
And all of these things have an impact on how much money they're going to make.
And let's not forget geography.
Oh, yeah, that's huge.
Where you live can have a big impact on, job opportunities.
Yeah.
And income levels.
Of course.
Living in a big city versus a rural area, they can make a world of difference.
For sure.
And then there's also the cultural aspect, right?
Culture is a huge part of this, too.
Different cultures have different values and priorities.
Yes.
And that can influence economic outcomes as well.
Absolutely. Some cultures emphasize entrepreneurship and risk-taking more than others. Some prioritize stability and community support more than others.
Yeah.
It all plays a role.
It's like Sowell is saying, hey, let's look at the whole picture.
Yes.
Before we jump to conclusions.
The whole picture.
Right.
That's what he wants us to see.
Yeah. And I think that's where his emphasis on traditional justice as kind of a foundation becomes so important.
It's the basis.
Because if we can focus on process ensuring that there's fairness in how decisions are made and how rules are applied.
Yeah.
Then that can actually be a more effective way.
More effective.
To move towards a just society.
Yeah, it's like creating a level playing field,
right.
Even if we can't guarantee that everyone's going to finish the race at the same time.
Okay, so traditional justice is about that level playing field.
Right.
But then how does this tie back to cosmic justice?
Okay.
Is Sowell saying we should just completely ignore disparities in outcomes?
That's a good question. And what's important to understand is he's not saying that we should be blind to disparities or that we should ignore injustices.
Okay.
He's acknowledging that historical injustices and discrimination have absolutely played a role in shaping those unequal conditions that we see.
Yeah.
But what he's urging us to do is to avoid attributing every disparity to discrimination.
So he's not saying discrimination doesn't exist. He's just saying it's not the only thing.
Exactly.
And maybe if we only focus on discrimination as the problem, we might miss out on other solutions.
It's about having a more nuanced understanding of the issue. Okay. That's what he's advocating for.
This is making me think about all those policies that are often well-intentioned.
Yes.
But then end up having all these negative, unintended consequences.
Oh, absolutely. He has some very compelling examples of this.
Yeah.
Like rent control.
Oh, yeah. Rent control.
On the surface, it seems like a great idea.
Right. Make housing more affordable for low-income renters.
Exactly.
Sounds like a policy designed to achieve a more just outcome.
Yep. Everyone deserves affordable housing.
Right.
But what he shows is that rent control can actually make things worse.
Because what happens?
Well, when landlords are forced to charge below market rents, they have less incentive to maintain their properties.
Right.
So the quality of affordable housing actually declines.
And in some cases, they might even just abandon their buildings altogether.
Exactly.
Which then reduces the supply of affordable housing even more.
It ends up hurting the very people it was meant to help.
Right. It's like this attempt to engineer a fairer outcome backfires.
Yep.
And ends up having the opposite effect.
It shows how even with the best of intentions, you can really mess things up when you're trying to manipulate outcomes without thinking about how complex the system really is.
Yeah, it's like trying to play chess, but only focusing on where you want your pieces to end up. And not how to strategically get them there.
Exactly.
And I think this is where Sowell's emphasis on individual responsibility comes back in.
Right.
He's not saying we should abandon, you know, social safety nets or that we shouldn't have policies that help promote opportunity.
Not at all.
But he's saying we have to recognize that true justice involves a balance between external support and individual agency.
It's not either.
Right.
Yeah.
It's both and.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the role of systems and structures.
Yes.
And individual choices.
Exactly. And sometimes the best solutions might involve helping people to make better choices.
Yeah.
And giving them the skills and habits that can lead to success.
So it's not just about changing the rules of the game. It's about helping people become better players.
I love that analogy.
So much to unpack here. So I'm curious, for those of you listening.
Yes.
What are your initial thoughts on these two types of justice, traditional versus cosmic?
Yeah.
Do you think one is more important than the other, or is it about finding the right balance?
Yeah.
Keep those questions in mind, because we're going to keep exploring this.
We'll be right back after the break. So we're continuing to explore this idea of justice.
Yeah, this complex idea of justice.
Exactly, and especially those potential downsides of focusing just on equal outcomes. And I think this next part we're going to get into is a topic that sometimes feels a little bit sensitive.
Yeah, it's one of those things that we don't always talk about.
Right, it can feel a little taboo.
A little risky.
Yeah, risky to discuss.
You're talking about the role of culture, right?
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Because, I mean, we all want to celebrate diversity.
Yes.
We want to respect different cultures, but can we acknowledge that different cultures might actually have different values and priorities without it being like, oh, you're being insensitive or whatever?
That's the challenge, right?
Yeah.
Can we have this conversation?
Can we even go there?
So All says we can and we should. He says it's like trying to understand a story, but you don't know the setting, you don't know the characters' backgrounds. Culture provides context.
Okay, so how does Sowell see culture actually playing a role in this whole idea of justice?
Okay, so first of all, he's not talking about judging cultures as being better or worse than others.
Okay.
It's not about that.
Okay. Yep.
It's simply about saying cultures are different.
Yeah.
And those differences can have a real impact on how people make choices and ultimately on the outcomes they experience.
So it's not about saying one culture is superior, but just acknowledging that they might emphasize different things.
Different values, different approaches to life.
Yeah, different ways of doing things.
Exactly.
And that those differences can show up in things like educational attainment, economic success, even family structures, community dynamics.
All of it.
All those different things.
All sorts of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is making me think about all those stories we hear about immigrants, who come to a new country with very little.
Yeah.
And then achieve incredible things.
Within a generation or two.
Yeah. Amazing success stories.
Those are the ones he highlights.
Yeah.
He uses those examples.
He does.
He talks about groups like the Lebanese in West Africa, the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Jews in Europe and America.
Yeah.
These groups often faced a lot of prejudice, discrimination, but they still managed to thrive.
And he's suggesting that part of their success might be because of certain cultural values.
It's a factor, he says.
Okay.
He points to things like a strong work ethic, a focus on education, delayed gratification, close-knit families that provide support, and instill discipline.
So it's like that cultural foundation.
It plays a role. Yeah. Of course, he acknowledges that not everyone in these groups is successful.
Right, of course.
And there are plenty of individual exceptions.
Yeah. We can't generalize about entire groups of people.
Right.
But it's interesting to think about how cultural patterns could be contributing to those broader trends that we see.
It's part of the picture.
Yeah.
And it's important to emphasize here, he's not saying cultural factors are the only Escalado explanation for why there are differences between groups.
Got it.
He's simply saying we need to include them.
Include them in our analysis.
In the equation.
In the mix.
Yeah.
Don't leave them out.
Right.
Yeah.
He says if we just focus on discrimination as the only explanation for every disparity, we're going to miss out on other potential solutions.
It's like if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
That's a good one.
Right?
Yeah.
If we only see discrimination as the problem, then all of our solutions are going to involve things like anti-discrimination laws or affirmative action policies.
Right.
Which might not be enough.
What if we also need to address cultural factors?
Okay, I see what you're saying. But how do you address cultural factors? And culture is such a complex thing.
It's deeply ingrained.
Yeah. Can we even change it?
Can we and should we?
We even try.
Those are tough questions.
Yeah.
And so doesn't pretend to have all the answers.
Okay.
He recognizes how complex and sensitive it is to try to influence cultural norms.
Right.
But he does suggest that sometimes just acknowledging those cultural differences can be a first step towards finding better solutions.
So it's not about, like you said, judging one culture as better or worse.
No.
But it's about understanding.
Understanding and respecting those differences.
Yeah.
But also recognizing that some cultural patterns might actually help people be more successful.
In a particular society or context, right? Because what works in one place might not work in another. And that's okay.
It's about recognizing those differences.
Yeah.
And then maybe having those open and honest conversations about how culture plays a role.
Without being afraid to talk about it.
Yeah, without shutting down the conversation.
Yeah.
Because maybe that's how we can figure out ways to support people from all backgrounds without just resorting to those one-size-fits-all solutions that might not actually work.
This is making me rethink some of my own assumptions, for sure.
It's powerful stuff.
Yeah. So I want to hear from you all listening.
Yeah.
How much do you think culture shapes our individual paths and our outcomes?
Good question.
Is it something we can even influence? And if so, how do we do it respectfully?
Lots to think about.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Thomas Sowell's The Quest for Cosmic Justice.
We're in the final stretch now.
Yeah, we're wrapping up our exploration of this whole idea of justice. And, we've been talking about all these different factors that come into play.
The complex, right?
Oh my gosh, so complex. And in this last part, we're going to tackle a concept that can be a little bit unsettling. Maybe even a little taboo to discuss. The role of luck.
Ugh.
Yeah, because it's this wild card that we often try to just ignore or downplay. Especially when we're talking about justice, right?
Yeah, we like to think we're in control of our own destinies.
Right.
It's
all about hard work and talent.
You work hard, you get what you deserve.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
Bootstraps.
Pull
yourself up.
Yeah, exactly. But Sowell is saying...
He makes a really good point.
That
We can't just pretend that luck doesn't exist.
We can't just sweep it under the rug.
No.
And he's not saying that effort and skill don't matter.
Not at all.
Of course not. But he is urging us to acknowledge that a huge part of our lives is shaped by things that are just totally outside of our control.
You got it.
It's like, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good.
That's exactly what he's saying.
Yeah,
sometimes it's just about being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
And so Will uses some really profound example to illustrate this point.
Right.
Where you're born, the family you're born into, your genetic predispositions.
Like all those things we have absolutely no say in.
Zero control.
Right.
But they have this massive impact.
Huge impact.
On the opportunities we have, the challenges we face.
And it makes me think about how often, we celebrate people who come from nothing and achieve great things. The self-made
person.
Yeah.
The American dream.
Right. But how much of that is actually due to things outside of their control?
Right. Were they just lucky?
Were they just in the right place at the right time?
Right place, right time.
Do they just happen to meet the right person?
Right. Connections, all that stuff.
It makes you wonder if this whole idea of self-made
needs a little bit of a
reality check.
Yeah. Maybe it's not all about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something else going on there.
And what's even crazier is that he's not just talking about like those big life-altering events.
Right.
He's also talking about those small, random things that can happen.
Yeah, those little things.
They can have a ripple effect.
He uses this analogy of a billiard ball.
Okay.
Imagine you're striking a billiard ball. Even the tiniest change in the initial angle at which you hit that ball can change where it ends up.
Oh, drastically.
That's a powerful image, like one tiny nudge.
One tiny nudge.
In a different direction.
Yeah.
And your whole life could be totally different.
Your whole life could be different.
It's like that butterfly effect.
Yeah.
The butterfly flaps its wings.
In Brazil.
And then there's a hurricane in Florida.
Exactly. It's like
crazy.
It's mind-blowing.
It's almost poetic, but it also makes you realize just how much is outside of our control.
How much we don't control.
Yeah. So if we accept that luck plays this big role, how does that change our understanding of justice?
Well, for one thing, it makes it a lot harder to judge people.
Yeah.
Do you know those black and white judgments?
Oh, yeah.
About success and failure?
Yeah.
If luck is such a big factor, then maybe the person who ends up wealthy and successful isn't actually more deserving
than the person who's struggling.
Right. It makes you question the fairness of the game itself. Not just the players. And that's where Sowell's ideas get really challenging.
Okay.
Because he's not saying that we should just give up and say, well, it's all up to fate.
Right.
Why bother?
Throw your hands up in the air.
He's still a huge advocate for individual responsibilities.
He's not letting anyone off the hook.
No, he's not.
But he is saying we need to be a little bit more humble.
A little more humble.
A little bit more compassionate in our judgments of others.
Because we're all just rolling the dice.
Because at the end of the day, we're all just rolling the dice.
Hoping for the best.
And
I think this recognition of luck can actually lead us to a more empathetic approach to justice.
Yeah.
It's less about trying to make everything perfectly equal.
Right.
And more about creating a society where everyone has a fair shot.
Even if we can't control everything.
Even if we can't control all the variables.
Right. So it's about acknowledging that life isn't always going to be fair. But we can try to create a system that gives everyone opportunity and support.
Regardless of where they started.
Regardless of what hand they were dealt.
Exactly.
Wow.
So much
to think about.
If you think.
I know I'm going to be processing this one for a while.
It's a lot.
For sure.
So much to unpack.
Huge thanks to Thomas Sowell for writing The Quest for Cosmic Justice.
Such a thought-provoking book.
Yeah, really got us thinking.
And thank you all for listening.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into justice.
We'll see you next time on the Deep Dive Night.